So you have just found yourself at Engagement Design and Journalism. I'm Lindsay Grace, and this is Maggie Farley.
Hi, I'm Maggie. This is my background.
By the way.
Journalism, ed tech, news literacy, and now I'm an adjunct professor at AU.
Great.
I'll talk to you in a minute.
And then real quickly, who I am. So some of you may know I've written more than 50 articles, book chapters, etc. on game design. I made a bunch of games at this point, my 40 games or so. I've also won some awards and some recognition, including being entered into the Hall of Fame for Games for Change. I've also done a variety of presentations and keynotes at a variety of organizations, as the one shown up here, GDC, Online News Association, etc., South by. And I've done several press appearances basically championing the power of playful design. Currently, I am the director of American University's Game Lab and Studio. The Game Lab and Studio is actually 5 faculty and 2 full-time staff. And essentially what we're doing is we're making really strong efforts in applying game design in non-game contexts. So if you really boil that down, one of our foci is the notion of engagement through play. So what kind of experiences can we design that are actually quite engaging using playful design? So the studio that I direct, and we have a new director in place, Bob Hone, has produced $800,000, a little more than that at this point, in game contracts and funding since it was founded in 2014. The clients for our work include the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the National Institute of Mental Health, Educational Testing Services, the World Bank, Deloitte, and a variety of others. Some of those which I can't share because we're under non-disclosure agreements. So you'll just have to trust me on that, as you often do in DC. All right. What we're here to talk about today is actually our Journalism Leadership Transformation Project. That's JOLT for short, and how most people know it. JOLT was generously funded by the Knight Foundation to the tune of $350,000. And essentially what we were trying to do is blend the worlds of game design and news. So if you visit our website, you'll learn this tagline, Innovation in Journalism Through Game Design. And this is really a joint project between a variety of entities. So our dean, Jeff Rutenbeck, has been a champion of this and really helped us get this off the ground. Amy Eisman, who's the chair of the journalism department at American University, myself, and we had 3 student fellows you may have seen as we've given these presentations at places like South by or GDC. In addition, we have some fabulous professional fellows, people who have professional work experience out in the real world, like Maggie Farley, who you'll hear from in a second, and Mitch Gelman, who will actually be part of the VR Summit tomorrow. We'll be doing some things together. So we went to a variety of organizations, the ones depicted here, and talked to them about some of the challenges that they're facing. And our real goal was trying to understand how we could better address them through game design thinking. So in reality, I want to emphasize that we're not just talking about news games. Sure, we make games about the news, but we're actually doing something much more complex and rich. And that's the idea of championing engagement design as a strategy for improving the way that people both produce and consume games. So if you think about it, the way we argue that this works is that engagement design is actually informed by game design. So we try to turn the tenets of game design into strategies for the media and news. We don't have time in 15 minutes to go through all of our strategies, but I encourage you to see our publication. Maggie and I did an academic publication last year that's actually how to handle these challenges and how to address the challenges in engagement design through game design. So feel free to snap a picture of that and find it, or you can find it at my website. Also, if you want an even easier primer, you can take a look at any of the, so I did the keynote in ONA London last year that takes some of these principles, as well as we did a collective panel and talk at South by and talked about engagement strategies at GDC last year. But really what we're interested in is figuring out how to keep people engaged. So our strategy for doing that includes this maybe often cited phrase that I've given before, which is that we know that content may be king. We've heard that from web designers for a long time. But what we're trying to emphasize is that experience is the kingdom. So you can have all the content in the world, but you actually need to put it in the right environment for people to care about it. And that's what we do. We basically claim that game designers are experience designers. And if you want some more sort of framing for that, think of it this way. So we help our players do. So we also know that engagement is dynamic. So the idea is that contemporary audiences really do want dynamic systems. We'll show you some evidence of that in a second. And we knew that news was always dynamic. News is a dynamic system in itself, but it's not always presented that way. It's not always reported as dynamic content. So what we're trying to do is help people bridge that gap. So one of the things to understand is that games are about doing. So if you think about how people perceive certain types of media, readers read the story, audiences watch the story, but players actually do the story. And there's no place that's more obvious that that happens than when you actually think about how people communicate what they do in games, right? When you ask someone, how do you play? One of their first questions is, what do I do in the game? So we explicitly design experiences that help people do, but do playfully. So a quick example of doing playfully is a game we did for Polygon called Square Off. So Polygon had this whole oral history, 2 years in the making. Matt Leone, the author, had actually done all this research on it. So we created a very simple sort of trivia experience that was also battle trivia. So as you played, you'd either successfully or unsuccessfully hit the enemy target. Story.
Okay, so games are great ways to dive into stories that are more complex. Stories like, what happens when the subway is disrupted? What will that do to your commute? Or your healthcare system is changing. Are your premiums going to go up? So you want less of a broadcast and more interaction. So we did this story with WAMU, which is the local NPR affiliate in Washington. They wanted to do a story about the shutdowns of the subway system and how it affected people. And so we made this simulation game, or an empathy game, about how it affected people in different communities. So to make it more engaging, we tried to make it real. So I went out on the trains and I interviewed 35 commuters. I talked to the Metro board members. WMU had a Facebook page. We got input from commuters about what their troubles were. And we created this composite character, Eduardo, who worked in a restaurant and had to get to work on time every day or he'd be fired. So then you have to make the choices as Eduardo. You wait for the train, it's gonna make you really late, or do you suck it up and get an Uber at rush hour that's 2 times surcharge? So from the feedback we got, it really resonated with people. One woman said it stressed her out so much she could barely play it. And so the thing that made it successful is that we got input from players and they felt recognized, that their own struggles were recognized, and the people who had never had that experience before realized that other people had a completely different experience than they had. The other thing that made it successful is that it was simple. We wanted to show WAMU that it's not really complicated to do engagement design. We just use Twine, open source, interactive narrative. It also brought a lot of new users to the website, and they were delighted with that. The numbers showed that there was a big traffic increase over the main article and the radio piece that went along with it. And I was the one who did both of those, so you can't blame the reporter for being boring. I think we can give credit to the game for being engaging. Okay, our next game is factitious. It is Tinder meets fake news. So you swipe right for real news and left for fake news. The funny thing about it is that we started this before fake news became a thing. We started when, before Donald Trump was president, before he was even running for president, we started looking into this news literacy. And he'd come up on the screen when you got the answer wrong. It was like, loser! But we had to take him out because it became all about the Donald. And actually, the fake news is still all about the Donald. And he's still firing people. So what is fake news? It's always existed. Propaganda, spin, misinformation, even advertising. Isn't that quaint? We used to worry about people being fooled by that. But in the last presidential campaign, more people shared fake news on Facebook than they shared real news. So it became actually kind of subversive and very confusing. So how do you slow people down to dig for the truth and not just pass on anything that's entertaining or inflammatory? So we made this game. We intentionally divorced it from context so it might look like it does on your Facebook feed. Um, so take a look at the story. How many people think it's true? How many people think it's fake? Okay, it's tricky. And so you can click on the source button at the bottom, and that's the single most important bit of context that tells you whether a story is credible or not. But if you still don't know, there's a bit of an explanation. This is where the learning sneaks in, because you want to know why you got it wrong if you got it wrong, or feel affirmed if you got it right. And so we have a little explanation, and then you can click through on the link to see the original story in its context. And then there are the hints, there are the red flags. Some sites, fake news sites, have disclaimers. All of them have really sketchy ads. And this one says, you know, media inquiries. I mean, are they the media? What are they anyway? So truth is a huge issue in journalism right now. So in Factitious, we tried to show the building blocks of a trustworthy story. And more broadly, we found that if people can play with the pieces of a news story, they can build their own conclusion, and they trust their own conclusion. These are two examples of good, transparent bits of data that people could play with. So Factitious is open source. It's available to newsrooms and classrooms so people can build their own games. But it's not just a fake news game. The really brilliant thing about the game engine is that it can be used for different things, for A/B polling, A/B testing, for polling, for human computation games, feedback. We're going? Okay, so we learn to engage people's sense of play, their sense of curiosity, their sense of competition. You want to know why you're wrong or why you're right. And people said that they use those tips that they learned when they're serving the news. Okay, so for people who make the news, engagement design brings its own benefits. As Lindsay said, when people do something, they're engaged. They're processing the information on a much deeper level. And younger people expect more interactivity, and in turn, they're willing to share a lot more information. So anyone who's taken those BuzzFeed quizzes, you've given up a lot of information. Thank you very much.
Great. And then we just wanted to conclude in our last minute and remind you that these engagement strategies actually take many forms. And one example I'd like to share with you is this game that the student fellows, when they were student fellows, they've all graduated since, designed. It's actually a game to increase your thirst for news. So this is an analog game about water consumption to produce specific types of foods. This was done during the concerns about the drought in California. And so you can see here, they're showing it actually at the museum in Washington, D.C. They've also shown it at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. And what was really great is it drew a lot of people in to think more completely and more deeply about the topic of water consumption and how our foods are produced. And we sort of wanted to end with a simple message that games tell some stories better than others. That includes helping people understand that interaction changes your audience participation, and that you want to show how the story is made to build trust. This is how we constructed the story. But we also want to emphasize that play can tell you about your readers and your content. So we explicitly did that in Factitious, for example, because engagement comes in many forms. That's us, and that's the URL for this particular game, Factitious game. Thank you.